Okay, so we're finally into learning the friction fire methods, but first, there's a reason why, in my opinion, the 5 axis or drill methods are in this order. And the reason for that is they go from less pieces, more effort, to more pieces, less effort. But the hand drill is truly going to be the one to master. If it requires excellent form, and if not, your hands are going to be pretty blistered and raw. And if there's a technique out of all of these that's going to cause self-injury, it's going to be this one. So this is a dojo, and our 2 main rules are personal responsibility and ukemi, or injury prevention and safety. So mastery of this form is going to be very important, and we're going to start off with this one first. But don't let that frighten you or discourage you, okay? Just keep going. Fire, keep up. Now after you get your first successes with your hand drill, it's going to be nearly impossible to stop. So you have to know when to give your hands a rest and just leave your hands alone for a while and let them recover. Now, out of all the primal 8 basics, the hand drill is probably the most globally universal found around the world. And if you remember, probably as a kid, you probably picked up 2 sticks and went like this, one across the other. Well, that's an actual technique called the fire saw, which we're going to do after we've gone over all the drill techniques. But we're going to start with the hand drill. Now, in past sections, you've seen me do the hand drill, and so you have an idea of how it goes. But what do you need to get started for the hand drill? Well, you need 2 pieces to start off. You need the spindle, and you need the base. Now the spindle, sometimes called a shaft, or a stalk, or a dowel, but we're just going to call it spindle. And for all the other drill methods, we're just going to call it a spindle too. And it is considered the male aspect of the method. And here we have the base, sometimes called a fireboard or a board. Sometimes it's called a hearth, but we're just going to call it the base. Now, usually the base is stationary, but not all the time, because in some methods the base is actually a part that moves. So, and the base is considered the female aspect of the method. Now, the base usually contains a cut-in container-like space called a notch, and this is where usually the COAL-EMBER is conceived and born. In learning your first hand drill, you have a few catch-22s. Now, you don't know what problems or what you need till you're actually doing it. And it's only when you're actually doing it that you realize what it is that you actually need and what problems you're going to run into. So the first thing we're going to need to do and go over is there's some tools that we're going to need, and there's going to be some parts we're going to need. So my first recommendation to you is we're going to go to a hardware store or someplace that sells wooden dowels. They usually come in 3 or 4 foot sections of different diameters. Now, we're first going to need to determine what your comfortable spindle diameter size is going to be. Now, I recommend you get, if you're in the United States, a 5/16, a 3/8, a 7/16, and a 1/2 inch. Now, in metric measurements, we want an 8mm, a 10mm, and a 12mm, if you can get those. So, but you're going to need all of these at least for references for later as well. And when down the road, when you start to gather your own natural materials, you're not going to waste your time gathering the wrong size, which you're never going to use anyway. And when you're at the hardware store, the first thing you want to do is check these for straightness by rolling them on the floor, just like this. So, if you could find this at the hardware store, is a gauge of different diameters. For example, for the hole for the 3/8, that'll fit right through there. So I know that that's an exact measurement. Now don't get the one at an arts and crafts store that's used for drawing. Now those circles are actually bigger to accommodate the pencil, so they're not an actual diameter. So you got to get the ones at like the hardware store for standard measurements. So now these hardwood dowels, they're not going to be the ones that we're going to be using to actually use as a spindle. They're just for measurements and for references. Now while you're at the hardware store, you're going to need some bases. Now I'm going to assume that it's the wrong time of the year, that you can't gather any kind of natural spindles, and you're not anywhere near that you're going to be able to find natural woods from the wilderness or from a park or anything like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up our first pieces right at the hardware store. So what you can use right off the bat from a hardware store is, and all of these are untreated. They can't be treated with any chemicals. They're just natural woods. You have cedar, you have Douglas fir, okay, and we have basswood, and we have just plain pine. Now when you look for the pine, make sure that it's not oozing any kind of pitch or resin or sap or anything like that. It should look fairly dry, okay, even if it's just kiln dried, that's fine. But it should look dry, it shouldn't look resiny, okay? And we have poplar. Now probably all of these, or a few of them, you could at least find at the hardware store. You could definitely find pine. I mean, that's going to be no problem. Cedar and Douglas fir are probably your other better bets. Basswood and poplar are probably going to be harder to find. So we could probably count on at least you getting a section of pine. And we want these sections to be at least ½ an inch thick, okay, and at least 2 inches wide. So at least ½ an inch thick and at least 2 inches wide. It doesn't matter how long it is. I mean, they're going to come in sections that are at least 4, 6, 8, 10 foot lengths. So you're not going to run out of basswood very soon. Now the other thing you're going to need is a spindle. Now I imagine it's going to be the wrong time of the year for you to gather plant stalks. That would be good, because you're really only supposed to collect them either before or after New Year's, in the dead of winter, when they fully matured and they've have dead and died. They've died on their own. So probably in the garden section of a hardware store or at a garden center, you're going to need to look for bamboo stakes, and they're going to need to be as straight as possible, and they're going to probably need to be, if you get your gauge, make sure you have that with you, they need to be at least 3/8 of an inch, at least 3/8 of an inch in diameter at the base, okay, would have to fit there, at a minimum 3/8. Now I've gotten fires as down as far as 5/16, but you don't really want to push that. That's not enough mass. So look for the 3/8, and the next size being 7/16, or if you're metric, 10 millimeters is going to be your best bet, I think. So now, if the garden center or the hardware store does not have bamboo stakes, you can go to an Asian food market, and they're going to have pairs of chopsticks that are very large, and I think they're 45 centimeters long. They're 45 centimeters long, and obviously they come in a pair of bamboo chopsticks. Now you take them out of the wrapper, and they come tied with a little string. So you just break the string off. Okay. Now when you get these, you're going to find that they're almost exactly 10 millimeters in diameter. Okay, which is like perfect size. And usually they're perfectly straight. And you get two, and they're about $1. Now, so I think your best bets, if it's the wrong time of the year to collect, plus we need to get started right away, is your bamboo garden stake, which is about 3/8 of an inch in diameter at the base. Or you go to an Asian food store where they have large bamboo chopsticks, and they're the ones that say about 45 centimeters long, and if you have your gauge, they're going to be 10 millimeters, and you're going to get a pair. Now, I highly recommend, if you find these, that you get 5 pairs. Just go ahead and buy them, spend the $5, get 5 pairs, because then that way you don't have to go back. You're going to go through these fairly quick. Okay? Now your absolute basic toolkit is going to be made up of really 3 things. A whittling knife, good strong knife, whether it's a pocket knife or a tang knife is fine, as long as it's a good strong and sharp knife. Now remember, safety first, so a dull knife is a very dangerous knife, because a dull knife has a greater chance of slipping and then you cutting yourself somewhere. Okay? You're going to need a hacksaw, or at least hacksaw blades. Okay, just get a few of those, and you're going to need different grits of sandpaper. So just get a few coarse, a few medium, and a few fine. So, and now I'm going to show you how to throw together your first hand drill real quick. So let's say you got a section of bamboo from a garden center. Now the very end of this measures 3/8 of an inch in diameter at the end, and it's very straight. Here we have that bamboo chopstick. It's fairly straight, and like I said before, it measures 10 millimeters in diameter. Okay, so we have that. Those are set to go. Now they should be at lengths of about just over a foot. Okay, at the very least. Okay, now the longer the better. Now you're going to want one that's probably at least 18 inches just to get started with. 18 inches would be a really good size, but these are definitely over 1 foot. Okay. Now your board, like I said, should be at least half an inch. Now this board is 3/4 of an inch thick. Now for a hand drill, half an inch would probably be better, but we'll just stick with the 3/4 of an inch. This one just happens to be 2.5 inches wide, and the length just happens to be about 5 inches. And this just was a regular piece of slat board or lath. So as you can see, I had started one here before, but we're going to start from scratch. So we're going to take our bamboo chopstick, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a point on it. So we're going to take our, you could do this 2 ways. You could use your knife and you can carve it down to a very shallow point. Okay. Now when you're carving, now safety first, remember that the blade and the direction of where the blade is traveling, that there's nothing in that path. So basically the rule is never cut toward yourself. So if my finger is here and I go like this, I'm actually cutting toward myself because myself is over here. Okay, so always have yourself behind the blade for cutting. Okay, so we're going to make a very, very shallow point. And I mean very shallow. So just to exaggerate my point, what we don't want is a pencil point like this. See, that's too high. What we want is a very, very shallow point that's very low. Okay? I'm sure you can see the difference. We really just want to make it where it's just barely above the cut. Okay, a very shallow point, just like that. Now, even if you don't have a knife to make that shallow point, you can take your sandpaper, hold your spindle on an angle of about 45 degrees, and turn it around, creating that shallow point. Remember, it's not a pencil point. And there we create that very shallow point. Now for our base, the first thing we need to do is mate these together. The male and the female need to be mated together, and then the notch needs to be made. So the next part is where it's burned and mated together. It needs to be far enough away from the edge where it doesn't fall out of the wood. So we're going to actually set it back at least 1/4 of an inch. Okay, at least 1/4 of an inch. And if you have another hole there in the area, or if you're too close to the side, you should be about, at a minimum, 1/4 of an inch away, but probably a little more than that is better. So I'm going to make a little mark there. Okay, I'm going to take my knife, and remember, we're going to be safe. We're going to do this on a table. Now we're not going to hold it like this. We're not going to hold it like this and go in like this and then possibly go through our finger or our hand. We're not going to lay it on our leg and do that too. Okay, we're going to do this on a table or on a bench, and in the path of the knife going this way, nothing is going to get injured or cut. Okay? Now, this is called an axis and a drill method, which means that the axis, or the drilling, needs to be really perfectly straight. Okay, so really how this method is done is in a kneeling position or a sitting position. Okay, now what I'm going to do is get on the table, and I'm going to show you the kneeling position. Okay. Okay, now in the kneeling position, you kind of want to set yourself up in like a triangle. So you have your foot here, you have your knee and your foot in sort of like a triangular type position. Okay. If you're like this, then you're not stable on your sides. Okay. At least giving yourself a triangle keeps you more stable. Now the other thing too is you have to be able to have a good open hip, because as you're doing this, as you go down, this arm is actually in the way of the spinning. So you have to kind of open up your hip a little bit. Okay. So, and when you're doing this too, first thing you want to do is kind of get your form down and warm this up. Okay. Now here's what I'm doing. I'm using as much of my hand surface as I possibly can. I'm not doing short strokes like this. Okay. You should put your fingertips to your palm of your other hand, and you should, when you do this, go all the way across where your fingertips are down to the base of your palm again. Okay? And we're going to try and keep this as straight as possible. Have your head almost going parallel with the spindle here. Okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to push in this way, inward, with both hands, and that allows us to rest our body weight on top of the spindle while it's spinning. So we're giving this two things. We're giving this speed with as much rotation as possible, Okay, now this is not enough rotation. What we want is a lot of rotation and a lot of speed. Okay, but the main thing that really causes the friction is the pressure. So we need to add pressure to that element. Now what will happen sometimes is the wood compresses together and forms a glaze. Well, you have to have enough pressure to be able to bust through that glaze. So we have some smoke, okay, and it's starting to mate together. Now, in order for it to be properly mated, the burn has to go actually up the sides of the spindle. So once we've covered all the way up to the sides of the spindle, okay, we're ready to carve our notch. So that's mated together. Okay. Now comes the making of the notch. The notch is where the coal gets born. By the way, you always want to save your dust. So have a bunch of index cards ready, and any kind of dust that you make with friction you want to save. I'm just going to put that aside for a minute. Now, how do you measure your notch? Well, you've made it about a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the board. Okay. Now, line up your knife with the side of the diameter of the hole that you just made, and run your knife up and down and make a line. Okay. Can you see those lines? Ran my knife up and down the sides of that, and then I'm going to run it down, straight down here, the edges of the board. Okay. Then what we're going to do is take our knife and we're going to carefully cut in. First, we're going to cut in a corner that way. Take out a corner. Then we're going to take out the other corner on the bottom. Okay. Then we're going to take out the middle. A little pressure and a little slice. Then we're going to take out a corner again. A little pressure, a little slice. A little pressure, a little slice. Pressure, slice. And we're going to head toward the center of that hole. So our goal is to make a triangle that runs almost to the center, but not quite. In a minute, I'm going to draw out the shape we actually want, because this is really tough to see. Now, your other option, instead of whittling that out, is to use your hacksaw. Take your whole hacksaw saw, or just the blade, put it on that edge, and you can probably get a more fine cut this way. But it's good practice to actually do it with a knife when you can, just to stay in practice, to make sure you can carve that notch when you need to. And again, in a primitive perspective, this would be done with stones or rocks. And either way, with the knife or the saw, this is considered a straight edge kind of cut, because it goes along the edge of the blade. And we're almost to the center. Careful that none of my body parts are in the path of the blade. Just a little bit. Now you don't really want to go all the way to the center, because what can happen is especially if you're using a solid type of bamboo. Now, if you have the garden stake bamboo, the inside actually has a hollow in it, okay? But the chopstick version of the bamboo comes from a very thick-walled piece of bamboo, and this is actually a solid bamboo. So your garden stake is hollow and your chopstick is solid, and that is a difference. Because I'm going to have to show you how to carve and take down a hollow spindle, because we only did the solid. Okay. Now our notch is just the way we want it. It goes straight through the entire board. The walls are parallel. Okay, we have a perfect triangle cut out of here. It's about 1/8 of a pie. If you were thinking in those terms, like of a pizza, it's 1/8 of a pie. Okay, and it goes almost to the center. Okay, and it's nice and wide. Okay. Now the other version of this form is the sit, or the kneeling. So some people's will sit like this with the board. Use the large one here. They'll sit like this with the board and do it this way. Or they'll kneel on it. So you can even take another board too, if that won't reach, and kneel on your board with another board like this, because you do need some space. Okay, but I'm going to turn this around so you can see me actually do. Now I'm going to go from start to finish with the whole technique. Now, as you can see here, okay, I have a couple wood shavings from when I took out this notch. Now, this whole notch has to fill with dust. Now, the problem is, which you wouldn't know yet, is that the higher this notch is, the longer it takes to fill. That's a lot of effort. And so this is why I said that the board should be about maybe 1/2 inch, and this one's 3/4 inch. Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take some of these shavings, and I'm going to actually fill that notch halfway already, so that I don't need to fill the whole thing with dust, only the top half. And I'm going to take our original chopstick, spindle, okay, and I'm going to try to do this in the sitting position. Now the first thing you're going to want to do is just do a warm-up. Just warm it up. Don't put a whole lot of pressure on it. You just want the woods to get to a higher temperature. Get as much rotation as you can. Get an average rate of speed. Okay. Got a little smoke. That's a good sign. So now I'm going to actually start filling the notch with dust. Now the problem is that every time you stop, it cools down. But we're trying to raise this to a temperature of about 700 degrees. So that's the sitting method. But I usually prefer the kneeling method. So we're going to do that, because I can get my body weight on the whole time. Oh, now here's a good example of what happens as a problem. So this is good for you to see now. This is called a nippling effect, where when you have a solid wood, it starts to burn down into the notch. Because what happens is this hole, it's hard to see, this hole actually traveled from where it originally was, and it started to move into the notch. And when that happened, the center of the spindle goes into the notch, which is why I say you don't put the notch in the center of the hole to begin with, because this is what would happen anyway. But when your piece actually travels, it goes into the notch and it creates this effect. And when that happens, it reduces the efficiency of this spin and the method considerably. So we didn't get a coal that time. So this is excellent for you to see. So we're going to do it again. Do everything again from scratch, and we're going to do it with the hollow version. Because this is one of the problems you will always constantly come across with all the drill methods, no matter what drill method it is, if you're going to do a solid. So when you have a hollow version of a plant stock or a bamboo, you don't necessarily sometimes want to cut through it like this. Because what will happen is the walls are so thin that they can't support a cut like this, and what happens is that they actually just split. The walls just end up splitting and they start breaking up into a bunch of little pieces, and you don't want to do that. So one of the best things you can do, actually, so I'm going to do an example on a piece of teasel. Teasel as a natural plant stock is very good for hand drill. And it is hollow, but you have to, it's very delicate where when you cut like this, the walls split. But here's how you want to do this. You want to take your knife and carefully, you're going to want to score. Now I'm cutting toward myself with this thumb, so you have to be very careful. So I'm going to put my thumb off to the side, so at least if I cut, it'll cut this way and not directly on my thumb. So I'm going to score carefully around the hollow first, like this with the edge. My thumb is off to the side, and it'll either just pop off, or if you're not careful, this whole thing will just split. But as you can see, that's the way to do a nice clean one. Now your other option, of course, is to take your hacksaw and just score around it that way. Now actually your saw, your abrading cutter, is always going to be better than a knife. It's actually a much better cut. When it comes to wood, sometimes sawing is a better option than cutting with a blade or a knife. Okay. Now, we saw how to mate a solid male spindle, with the base. But how do you mate a hollow spindle? Because you cannot create a point. You can't create a point where's the axis going to come from. So what we do is we take the flat of the spindle, which is hollow, and again you go back about 1/4 inch from the edge, at least 1/4 inch, and 1/4 inch from your next hole at least. And what you do is you make a mark. You just make a circle on the wood, and there's a ring. It's kind of hard to see, but I've pressured a ring into the board, and I'm going to take my knife. What I'm going to do is take the point, okay, so here's my ring, okay, that I pressured into the board. Now I'm going to take my knife. Now if you look at the point of your knife, if you look at the very point of your knife, it's actually a triangle. Okay? Now the blade part, I'm going to face out like this, and I'm going to create a triangle on the board. If you can see that. Now I'm going to make a whole bunch of little triangles that match up. I'm going to put the point into the tip of that first triangle, which is right on the ring edge of that, and I'm going to just work it forward like that. And I'm going to spin it, put the point edge in the triangle I just made, work it forward. Put the point in there, work it forward. Put the point in there, work it forward. Remember, nothing is in the path of the cut for safety. Okay, and we're making our way around the very edge of that ring. Not on the outside of the ring you made, right on the ring. Now you can always make the hole a little bigger, but once you made the hole, you can't make it smaller. Okay. And we've made a complete ring around there with a whole bunch of little triangles that we pressured in there. Now we're going to take our knife carefully, and what we're going to do is we're going to carefully, without anything in front of the knife, pry out that section that we just, it should pop out like a button. And we pop out that button carefully. Okay. And now we've created a crater for the hollow end. Just going to clean that up a little bit. For the hollow end to fit in. Okay. Clean that up a little bit. Get those little pieces out of there. And let's see how well that mates together. That's a fairly good fit. Now it should just sit inside and not go anywhere. Alright. Now, next thing we have to do is mate this together. Now, I'm going to call that mated. I'm going to call that mated because it's pretty much ready. Okay, our little hole right there, because I know it fits. Now, this time, I'm going to take the hacksaw and I'm going to cut us a notch. Again, I'm going to find the edge of our hole, on the edge of the diameter, and I'm going to work down the side. I'm going to find the other side of the diameter of the hole, make a mark, and I'm going to go straight down the wall of that side. Okay. And I'm going to take the hacksaw and I'm just going to cut my way toward the hole. And here I want to show you the notch. Now, it goes clean through the board. The walls are all parallel, all along the side, and it goes not quite, but almost to the center. It should get as close to center as possible. And here's that one we did earlier where the solid bamboo burned into the notch. You could see that the notch, you could see actually that the circle moved. I call that drift. So in the burning process, my angle was off and it created a drift, which I'll go over later, toward the notch and went into the space. So your notch can't be too big, because if your notch is too big, it allows for drift, like this one. But my angle was off when I was doing that to begin with. So you can see that goes almost but not quite to the center. And actually, if you can make that point of the triangle that goes towards center a little wider, almost like a trapezoid kind of look, but remember, it shouldn't go to the center. So you can widen that in there, but don't let it go all the way to the center. And you can see here I have my guide marks of where the diameter of the circle goes straight out, and that is where I begin to cut in from my notch. Okay. Now we're going to do the kneeling method with a hollow bamboo on this piece of pine. Okay, so remember earlier I talked about saving all your dust. Well, this is the dust from the method that we just did that didn't work. But you know what? This dust is actually very important. You should always save this, because what this does is it helps you start fires later. It's called coal extender, which I went over before, and so we need to save that. Now the reason why this is going to be very useful now is because the board is so high. Now I don't want to spend a lot of effort to fill this notch. So what I'm going to do is we're going to pre-fill that notch. And we're going to pre-fill it, this time not with the shavings, but with the dust from the previous attempt. Okay, so we're going to load that all in there. Now, I'm going to kneel on it with another board, because this base is too short to fit under my knee. And we're going to use our hollow 2.5 foot long garden stake piece of bamboo. So here we go. First I'm going to warm it up. Get a lot of rotation. It's already starting to smoke. The dust that's being made is of a very good color. That's what we want. So I'm going to get more speed, more rotation, more pressure, more speed, more rotation, more pressure. Oh, and we have a coal. Now it should roll it out. So let's get the dust out of there. Put all our dust together. Let's make sure it has enough fuel. and then we would put that in our tinder bundle. So I'm really trying to teach this in as much of a linear fashion as I can, you know, kind of like A, B, C, D, but most of the time that's usually not possible. So a lot of this can tend to be like mosaic or very patchwork kind of teaching. So one of the things that I still need to go over with you is the spindle preparation. Now when you're gathering natural materials like this lettuce spindle, but or with the bamboo, there's always going to be pieces that stick out. Now on the lettuce there are the little branches that would come off. Well, that needs to come off. And then there's the nodes, because in between the sections of the bamboo, they're hollow, but then they're interspaced with these places called nodes, where there's an actual plane of wood that goes in between from where branches of leaves would come off and grow off of. But as much as the middle section is very smooth and without any kind of obstruction, the nodes sometimes stick out a little bit and you need to kind of take that down. Well, again, the best way to do that is by abrading. So you have your sandpapers. You may want to go from a coarse down to a medium and then down to a fine and get it just right, and try to get it as smooth as you can so that doesn't wreck your hands, because as you go down the spindle with your hands, obstructions like this can cause extra blistering, and you don't want that. So the main rule with these nodes or any of these small branches that come off, what you really want to do is make sure you know which is the bottom and which is the top, kind of a north and south. Now the way the branches come off, okay, when you start to remove this, you may want to start to remove it with your knife at first. Do not go down the way that, if the branch was growing up this way, okay, don't cut down like this, because a lot of times the grain runs actually into the spindle and you'll actually end up cutting into the spindle, and you don't want to do that. Or if you tear the branch away, again the grain will tear away and then you tear into the spindle. So when you cut with your knife, you start from the bottom of where the branch is and you cut up. So you cut from the bottom of the spindle toward the top when you're trying to smooth down these branches that stick out, or these nodes. And cut up so that meets that, and then that smooths down just like that. Okay. Again, this one here, you can see that sticking out. The branch was growing this way. Okay, so I'm going to cut up from the bottom to the top that way, because if I go down, it will run into the grain and then run into the spindle. And I don't tear it out because I could end up tearing out fibers, and then that'll leave a crater in the spindle, and then that leaves that nice and smooth, which is really good. Same thing with the bamboo. You may have small ridges of where the branch was coming out, or sometimes it just sticks out a little bit. You could take that down with your knife a little bit, but it's actually better to do that either with an abrader, the sandpaper, okay, or with a file. Okay, you get yourself a nice, actually you probably don't need a coarse file for this, maybe a medium or even a fine, and take your time taking that down nice and smooth so that it gets to be as even as possible with the rest of the spindle. Okay. If you need to go with a slightly coarser one to work that down, you can do that. Try not to use a rasp for that, and then use the finer one. Now, a thing about scoring or cutting spindles, okay? Now, whether it's a solid, like the bamboo chopstick that we were working with before, or hollow, like this lettuce, it has an actual hollow in it, as you can see. There isn't even a pith. It's definitely hollow. that hollow, that space has a name. It's called a lumen, L-U-M-E-N. And again, you have to be careful whenever you're trying to cut a hollow stalk because they could start to splinter. You have to do that very carefully, and that's called the process called scoring. Now, on a primitive way of doing it, you would use a stone flake, like these sharp pieces of flint. And this is a piece of quartzite, which came off. These are flint. But you see that they have, these flakes that came off have straight edges. And that's really what you want. And you don't necessarily want them to be sharp, but you want them to have kind of like a sawtooth, a very fine sawtooth edge, which is what you want for working with wood. That's much better a lot of times, unless you're doing things like scraping. But we're not doing that here. We're going to do scoring, which is a way kind of like a fine sawing. So you could take your piece, have it down, take your fine sawtooth edge on your stone and just turn the piece around and saw into it very carefully. Don't put too much pressure because you don't want to crush your stalk. Okay, and that's working really well. And as you can see, start cutting a line into it with the stone. Okay, it was all the way around. Now sometimes it gets tiring holding your piece, so sometimes you can make a very quick vise. And what you do is you take two flat boards, put a stick in between, tie that down, okay, kind of like a seesaw effect, and then you could take your flake, like this piece of quartzite here, put it in one end, okay, and then you take a wedge of some sort and you stick it in the other end, okay, and then we'll just force that in there to tighten it down. Okay, so we have the wedge in this end and we have the flake in this end, and that's solidly held in there. And then we can just have that there on our table, and then instead of the stone moving around the piece moves around the stone, and you can cut it that way. And you just keep turning it around till you finally get the job done. This will work on a solid piece too, not just a hollow, if you want to be careful. But that's sometimes a good tool to have. If I didn't mention, probably 3 times already, bamboo is my my favorite out of all the vegetation. And as a side note, bamboo is neither a plant nor a tree. Bamboo is a grass, just like the grass on your lawn. And so it comes from that family. So my favorite is actually not a plant or a tree, it's a grass. And very versatile, has a lot of uses other than making fire too. People build houses out of it, a lot of other tools out of it. And so let's see, I think that's it. All right, on to the next thing. Oh, see, again, I forgot. When you're scoring, you could use your fine tooth actual saw. So you're creating the same effect with the stone. Okay, so use your fine tooth saw to score around. You might, to start off, don't hold it straight down. Start off actually on an angle and start your line like this. Start it off on an angle and start your line like this. If you could see me holding it on like a 45. And then once you get that started, once you get your line going, you can start to do your back and forth, and then carefully turn it around, and then go full on the cut. Keep turning. And then your other option too is to actually use a file. Some files have very good corners on them. Use that corner to start your groove this way. If you want to do something finer than a saw, the abrading action of the file is going to be very useful. Around that way. Keep turning your piece, work your way around, and then if you want, you can work to even a medium file from a fine, and you can even hear the difference. It's doing a bigger bite than the finer file, and work your way around that way. I like to use files a lot when I'm doing scoring, and occasionally the saw. And if I want to keep in practice, I'll use the stones. Also, when you're taking down your nodes, or you're taking down these little branches here, so again, from a primitive point of view, you take your grainy, either sedimentary type stone, like a river rock, something like that, and you'd sand it down that way. Okay, your nodes too on your bamboo, you can take it down that way. Or you can have your stone there, have your stone here, like example, this really long piece of river rock, okay, and the stone stays in place, and you move the node around and around and around, and that makes it much easier than you just moving the stone. Now here I want to clarify an example that we did before of trying to create that crater when you're trying to mate a hollow spindle with your base. Now it might have been a little harder to see before, but the point of your knife, when you look at it straight on, the point of a knife when you look at it straight on here is a triangle. So when it makes a mark like this here, and I rock it forward, it's a triangle. So the blade part here, and then there's the back of the blade, which makes it wider, creates a triangle type shape. So what I'm trying to do before is you take your hollow, and this is really exaggerated, you take your hollow and you press it against your base, and you would make your mark. So these two lines represent a giant hollow, is what this does. So you would take your knife, and right on that last line, you're going to take the point of your knife, and carefully, so you don't cut yourself, is you're going to press it in and rock forward and create that triangle. Now this is really hard to see. So what I've done is I've made a triangle here right on this line, just like this. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is put the point of that knife inside the point of that triangle where I just was, and again do the same thing. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm putting the point there and making another triangle like that, and then making another triangle like that, and another triangle like that, and I'm working my way around this ring. So I put the point in the tip of the blade of that triangle and work it forward. Put the point in the tip, work it forward, and then I work my way all the way around, and then eventually I would be able to pop out my crater, and it should come in one piece, but this is a big exaggeration. Now the other thing too is you want to make sure that your base, that the grain of the wood actually runs this way. Okay, you don't want the grain running this way. You don't want to do that because the board could actually just break. So you want the grain to be running the entire length of the board. The other thing too is, I don't know if you could see these, there's a knot here, a knot in this pine, there's a knot here. Now whenever you're mating your board, you want to stay away from these knots. The knots are a different hardness than the rest of the board. They are actually harder, and that'll throw off your friction. So wherever it is that you're mating your base to your spindle, keep it away from knots. Make sure, like we talked before, it's at least 1/4 of an inch away from the edge and away from other holes or from there. And you want the grain to be running the length of the board this way, not this way. Okay, not this way, but this way. The long way. Alright? Let's move on. Other than the kneeling and the sitting, another form you can do is, if you're by yourself, is to do standing if your stalk is long enough. Now this stalk is almost 3 feet tall, the bamboo, so we're going to use this board of Douglas fir, and we're going to show you real quick the standing form. Now again, your spindle should be as straight as possible, and we're going to warm this up. Again, we're going to get as much rotation as we can, using as much surface area on our hands as we can, warming it up. So we're getting some smoke. It's starting to fill with dust. So at least with this position, if your stalk is nice and straight, you can really get a lot of good body weight on this. Get this one going. There we go. There comes a point too when you're using your solid spindle that it actually starts to round off. And I'm going to get into more detail with that later, but the center of the spindle, when it's solid, spins slower than the outside. So the outside of the spindle eats away faster than the center, which makes the tip of the spindle actually round off. And when that happens, you actually want to try to start flattening it off. So you can take your coarse sandpaper, and then later your medium and your fine if you feel. And you have to be careful about doing it this way, because what can happen is you'll actually tear the grain, you'll tear splinters right off the edge of the spindle if you're not careful. So you might want to go in a bit of a circular pattern. It depends. You can't necessarily do this with a hollow. You have to do this with a solid, because if you do this with a hollow, you'll definitely you'll tear the grain right off the spindle. So very gently work your way around to make that flat again, so that the surface area mates well with the base. And again, the other thing you can do is take your abrading stone and go that way, or take your smaller stone and work it that way. Take your time and get that down. Okay? So you want to make that as, once it's mated, you want it to get it as flat as possible, because again, remember, we're starting off with our shallow point just to get it mated. But once it starts rounding off, you want to actually try to make it as flat as possible. It's actually the outer rim of the spindle that we really want, which is what makes the hollows work so well, but we're going to get more into that later. Alright? Now this is a base of Atlantic white cedar, and this is our solid piece of bamboo chopstick. And just to try this again, we're going to create this mark from which we're going to carve out the center. Now you could do this with both a solid as well as a hollow, but I just want to demonstrate this again. I'm putting this in the point, I'm going around the rim. Now the hardest part actually is, remember, the grain is going lengthwise, so the grain is going this way. So you really need to make sure that when you're cutting the grain across, that it's nice and deep. Remember not to cut yourself. Now, when you're cutting the length of the board this way, it's actually easier because you're going with the grain. But when you're going across the grain, you really need to make sure that you're really cutting the grain, because that's an important point. See, this way is easy because I'm going with the grain, but when you go this way, going across the grain, and then you would pop out your button. And just clean that up. Okay. And that should fit nicely. Doesn't slip or move. It's a good solid hole. And again, so you could see close up, I take the diameter, each side of the diameter of the hole, and I take my knife and I mark it straight down. You can see those marks. Okay. Now I lift this up, I roll it, and I find those marks, and then I go straight down the side. And these are the marks of how and where I make my notch. So again, the first thing I'll do is take out a corner. Careful not to cut myself. Nothing's in front of the blade. Take out the other corner. I'll take out the middle. Okay, and then I'll just keep going from there until I get, again, to almost center. Okay. Now something I want to go over real quick is the shapes of the notches. Now we're going to say that this is a base, and these diameters are where we've already created either a crater or we've mated our spindle to our base. And then it's time to make our notch. So again, we take our knife and we find our diameter and we go down the sides of the wood, and this marks how we're going to go into our into the base to make our notch. Now some of the shapes that you can do, now if this is center of the mated hole, one example is a box notch, which is basically a rectangle which goes not quite to center but goes straight in. Okay, so that's a box notch. Then there's your classic wedge notch, which, if you find your diameter, okay, goes in and comes just before the center from there, and then you would take that out. Okay, but my favorite, which I want to let you know, is kind of a trapezoid shape, which is a mix between the two. So what I want to do is kind of have the effects of both. So before center, I create something that is part triangle but is kind of squared off like that. And this is the kind of notch I like to have. But again, you have to be careful that it isn't too wide, that especially if you have a solid, it starts to burn down into the notch. See, this may be a lot of space taken out that can't support the spindle. But again, we'll go over for that later. But you have your box notch, you have your wedge, and then you have something that's in between, which is one of my favorites, which is the one that I usually tend to do when I cut it out. Okay, there we go. So a couple of things that I highly recommend is that you actually keep a journal. So you get some kind of logbook or notebook and write down your successes as well as your fails, okay, and keep track. As well as you're making a list of all the woods or plants that you've gone through, and maybe there's some ones that you want to try, so you put that kind of on a wish list, things like that. And whenever you are doing a method or practicing a method, it's always good to have a lot of index cards around. And what you really want is a medium size or fine point permanent marker, like a Sharpie. And again, I mentioned that you always want to mark the name of whatever your spindle is and whatever your base is. Write the names of what those are on there, because a lot of times you're just not going to remember. And then when you go to show somebody, it says it's written right on there what it is. And that way there's no confusion. So positively identify what the plant or the wood or the bamboo is and write the name down on there. And then when you're practicing your method, okay, with your index card, you're going to draw a space on space, the date and the time. And if I get this coal, I'm going to write bamboo on Atlantic white cedar base, today's date, this isn't today's date though, at such and such time. And even if I do get it or I don't get it, at the bottom I'm going to write COAL-EMBER, or I'm going to write fail. So or I may not, and then what I'll do is I'll take my digital camera and take a photo of it. So if I get the coal, I'll fill in the names here, write coal, put it down here next to the coal and the base and the spindle, and I'll take a digital photo of it and keep it as a log. And then I'll write it in my journal as to what's been done and what I haven't done. And it's a good way to keep track. And the photos are an excellent resource for you to actually look back on and see what you did and what you haven't done. So we didn't do too well on our bamboo solid chopstick spindle, but you saw an excellent lesson, which is very important, which is that it can burn into the notch if your angle is off or if your notch is too wide. So another thing too is you can see I'm kneeling on a leather pad. Now you can get yourself some knee pads or anything that's going to save you from, injuring your knees, or it's just hurting. Just make it fun, make it safe for yourself. I'm securing the board down here with another, I'm securing the base down with another piece of board. And we have good ventilation. I'm in my sunroom. The windows are open. And but another key of ventilation is you may want to have a fan around, which you have to blow the smoke away so it's not in your face, because you don't want to be inhaling any of the smoke anyway. Even if it is kind of benign, it's just not healthy. So what this does is this keeps, if you keep this off to the side right here, this keeps the smoke out of your face, but make sure that this isn't on so much or it's blowing directly into the notch that it blows your coal away before you're even done. So you keep it either behind or in a place where the wind isn't going to destroy your efforts to begin with. You just want it to perform the function of getting the smoke out of the way, not ruining what you're doing. So we have that. And when you're doing your method, it's very important that you keep breathing. Okay, don't be holding your breath. So you might want to talk a little bit while you're actually doing the method. Oh, so by the way, this is the Atlantic white cedar. We have the bamboo spindle. I filled the notch with a little bit of the coal extender dust. What that is old friction fire method dust from previous attempts. Now when you warm up your board, in a way that's just like warming up your water when you want it to boil. Because when you put your water on the stove, it doesn't just boil. It needs to heat up and get to a certain temperature before it can actually boil. So that's what we're doing. So what we're doing first is we're getting it to that temperature where it can start to boil. So the notch is starting to fill with dust. Now there's a funny thing that I've heard in my past, that there's really two times when a man feels like he's given birth. which of course is a aspect only given to women. And the most painful one is a kidney stone, because then that actually feels like childbirth pain. But the most fun one is this one, because you're actually giving birth to an entity, which is fire. So make sure you're still breathing, get plenty of rotation, plenty of speed. And there's our coal. I'll let it smoke a little bit. So this is our solid bamboo spindle on Atlantic white cedar. So we'll go solid bamboo. Oh, I forgot to mention, you have to put the method. So we're going to put hand drill, so you know what method you did. Solid bamboo hand drill on Atlantic white cedar base. And today's date and what would be the time, we get a coal. Okay, and I put that there next to my implements, the bamboo, the base, and I take a picture of this with the coal. Well, that went well. So a lot of these methods that I'm going to be showing you, the hand drill included, now they can all be done with 2 people. But I'm only going to demonstrate every single one of these techniques as if it's just one person. Actually, for the main reason to keep in mind that as the fire keeper, as the person who's taking responsibility for the lives of other people, it's called upon your skill to be able to pull this off, because you're not going to be able to rely on other people being able to do it. So your skills have to be in top condition where you can pull off all of these techniques all by yourself. Now, for training and for practice and for fun, it's no problem to have other people do it. You can have one person hold the board for you while you're doing the technique, or you could trade off. Like you go down the stalk and then the next person takes over, and that's fine. In fact, if you go on YouTube and you look at all the videos, for example, the Maasai tribe of Africa, you're going to see them trading off, doing their hand drill. And you know what, there's no problem with that. You know, that's what it's all about, being a tribe. You're all working together as a team, and you're saving yourself from getting hurt. You're not getting, you're saving each other from getting blisters or hurting your hands and getting tired out. So, but just keep in mind, all these methods could be done 2-person, but you really want to try to get it down where you're the one that can pull it off, just because of the responsibility involved. Not out of ego, but because of keeping your skills at a high level to be able to help others. All right, just keep that in mind.